The date is January 11th, 1898. The place is Fort Smith, Arkansas, and the time is exactly 11:10 p.m., high above the street, on the upper floor of the Grand Opera House. A man is standing at a window. His name is George Carter. George is a fireman, a man trained to look for danger, a man paid to spot the curl of smoke or the flicker of an ember that doesn't belong. But tonight, George isn't looking for fire. He is looking at the wind. Down below him, Garrison Avenue is dark. The gas lamps are flickering, struggling against a breeze that feels wrong. It feels greasy. It is January, deep winter, yet the air clinging to the brickwork of the opera house is hot, humid, sticky. It smells of wet earth and sulfur. George leans his forehead against the cool glass of the window pane. He presses his hand against the surface. He watches the streetlights sway. He has no idea that he is looking into the barrel of a loaded gun. To understand the tragedy of George Carter, you have to understand where he is standing. The Grand Opera House. It is a symbol of civilization on the frontier, a place of velvet curtains and laughter and music. It is a structure of brick and mortar, built to withstand the ages. It feels permanent. It feels safe. And that feeling, that safety, is the most dangerous thing in the world right now. George checks his pocket watch. 11:12 p.m. The wind outside changes tone. It stops whistling and starts to moan. A low vibration, like a train moving underground. George squints into the darkness. He sees something. Or maybe he just feels something. Shifting in the blackness beyond the city limits. He doesn't know that 3 miles away, a stone wall, 5 feet thick, has just been pulverized into dust. He doesn't know that the pressure in the room behind him is dropping so fast. His ears are about to pop. He stands there, the fireman, the watcher, and then the glass against his forehead begins to vibrate. In forensic history, we often look for the patient zero, the first infection. But in a disaster, we look for the first victim. George Carter doesn't know it, but his name is already carved into the history books. He has, perhaps, 120 seconds left to breathe. He watches the darkness, and the darkness stares back. But before the glass shatters, before the roof of the opera house is torn from its moorings like a sheet of paper, we need to stop the clock. We need to rewind. Because to understand why George Carter is standing at that window and why 55 people are about to die in the dark, we have to go back to sunset. We have to understand the lie that the weather told to the city of Fort Smith. Let's go back to earlier that evening. January in Arkansas is supposed to be hard. It is supposed to be brittle. The ground should be frozen iron. The wind should bite your face. But on January 11th, 1898, the sun went down on a city that was sweating. The temperature had climbed all day. A warm, moist tongue of air had licked its way up from the Gulf of Mexico, settling over the Arkansas River Valley. It brought a heaviness with it. The kind of weather that makes dogs restless. The kind of weather that makes old wounds ache. People walked out onto their porches on Garrison Avenue and fanned themselves. They looked up at the sky. It wasn't the gray steel of winter. It was a bruised purple. But the city of Fort Smith was booming. It was a border town, the gateway to the Indian Territory. It was a place of commerce, of brick factories, of newly built schools. It was a modern city, and modern cities. Don't worry about the wind. We talk a lot in disaster psychology about something called normalcy bias. It is the brain's defense mechanism, the refusal to believe that the world is about to end, because it has never ended before. At 8:01 p.m., a storm did roll through. Thunder cracked over the river. Rain lashed against the windows of the boarding houses. Lightning illuminated the new, uninsured Fort Smith High School. And the people, they relaxed. They thought, that's it. The storm has broken the heat. The danger has passed. Mothers tucked their children into bed. Dr. W.T. Cate, a prominent physician, sat in his home, listening to the rain fade away. He lived right next to that new high school. He felt safe in the shadow of that massive brick institution. He didn't know that the building next to him, that symbol of progress, was essentially a pile of ammunition waiting for a spark. But the first storm was a lie. It was a decoy. It cleared the air, but it didn't clear the energy. In the atmosphere above the city, unseen by human eyes, invisible mechanics were at work. Cold, dry air from the Rockies was colliding, violently, with that warm soup of Gulf moisture. It is a recipe for violence that the Midwest knows well. But in 1898, they didn't have Doppler radar. They didn't have sirens. They didn't have a voice on the radio telling them to take cover. They only had their eyes and their ears. And as the clock ticked past 10 p.m., the city of Fort Smith went to sleep. The lights in the houses flickered out one by one. The streets grew quiet. The normalcy bias had set in. The rain had stopped. The danger was over. Or so they thought. But out in the dark, to the southwest, something was forming. It started as a rotation in the clouds, a tightening of the wind, a fist clenching in the sky. If you were standing in the fields outside the city at 10:30 p.m., you might have felt the pressure drop. You might have felt your ears pop. You might have smelled the ozone. The wind wasn't screaming yet. It was gathering. It was sucking the air out of the valley, feeding itself, growing. And the most terrifying thing about this monster, it was invisible. It was pitch black on a pitch black night. There was no moon to illuminate the funnel. There was no lightning to silhouette the shape. It was a ghost, a phantom of pure kinetic energy, moving at 40 miles per hour, straight toward the sleeping city. The clock strikes 11 p.m. Most of the city is asleep, but on the outskirts, directly in the path of the storm, lies a place that is always asleep, the National Cemetery. It is a solemn place, rows of white headstones, soldiers from the Civil War, men who had faced cannon fire, and muskets, and bayonets. They lay in neat, orderly rows behind a massive stone wall. This wall is important. We need to visualize this wall. It is built of solid stone. It is 5 feet thick. It is an engineering marvel designed to stand for centuries. It is designed to say, this ground is hallowed. This ground is protected. At 11:05 p.m., the ghost in the dark reaches the cemetery, and this is where the physics of the night become impossible to comprehend. There is no gradual buildup. There is no warning gust. The tornado, hitting the earth with the force of a freight train, simply erases the wall. It doesn't just knock it over. It doesn't just crumble it. It flattens it. 5 feet of solid mortared stone, reduced to gravel in a fraction of a second. The wind roars into the cemetery. It tears through the trees. These are old oaks, ancient sentinels that have stood watch over the dead for decades. They are snapped like dry toothpicks. The sound must have been apocalyptic. The crack of timber, the grinding of stone, the howl of the vortex. But here is the horror. Who heard it? The dead? The cemetery is a mile from the city center. It is isolated. The roar of the destruction there was swallowed by the distance. The canary in the coal mine died screaming, but nobody heard it. The tornado moves on. It leaves the dead behind and turns its hungry eye toward the living. It crosses the open ground. It picks up speed. It is filled now with debris. It is no longer just wind. It is a blender. It is churning with rocks and branches and dirt and the pulverized remains of that stone wall. It is a shotgun blast, miles wide, aiming for the heart of Fort Smith. And back on Garrison Avenue, George Carter is still standing at his window. He is looking at his watch. 11:13 p.m. He notices something strange against the glass. It isn't rain. It sounds harder, heavier. Click, click, click. He leans closer. It looks like marble, white, perfectly round. Spheres of ice, hail, marble-sized hail, falling from a black sky. George frowns. Hail? In the middle of the night? In the middle of a heat wave? He doesn't know that this is the final warning. The hail is the fallout from the updraft. The debris falling from the top of the monster that is now towering thousands of feet above his head. He doesn't know that the pressure wave is already shaking the foundation of the Opera House. He doesn't know that the National Cemetery wall is gone. He doesn't know that he is about to become the first name on a list of 55. The normalcy bias is about to be shattered, along with every pane of glass in the city. The clock ticks to 11:14 p.m. The roaring sound gets louder. It stops sounding like a train, and starts sounding like the earth itself is tearing apart. George Carter takes a breath. He puts his hand on the latch of the window. He intends to open it, to see what is out there. He never gets the chance. 11:14 p.m. 59 seconds. Time is a funny thing in a disaster. We think of time as a constant, a tick, followed by a tock, a steady rhythm that marches forward. But anyone who has been in a car accident, anyone who has fallen from a ladder, anyone who has looked death in the eye, they will tell you the truth. Time is elastic. It stretches. It warps. It can freeze completely. For George Carter, standing at the window of the Grand Opera House, that last second is an eternity. He is looking at the hail, those white marbles bouncing off the windowsill. Click, click, click. But then, the clicking stops, and the roaring begins. It isn't a sound that starts low and builds up. It arrives instantly. It is a wall of noise. Survivors would later struggle to describe it. They called it 10,000 freight trains. They called it the sound of a mountain grinding its teeth. But for George, it is the sound of the air itself, exploding. The atmospheric pressure outside the Opera House drops so violently and so quickly that the building actually expands. The brick walls, solid and heavy, breathe outward. The glass window in front of George doesn't just break, it detonates. In the forensic reports, they say a shard of glass killed him. But that is too clinical. That is too clean. The window explodes inward, a shotgun blast of razor-sharp diamond. One specific shard, jagged, long, and moving at perhaps 100 miles per hour, finds its mark. It pierces George's torso. He falls. He doesn't have time to be afraid. He doesn't have time to process pain. He is dead before he hits the floor. The first victim, the man who watched the storm, becomes the first part of the storm's wreckage. But the storm isn't finished with the Opera House. It is just getting started. The wind, now rotating at speeds that defy comprehension, grabs the roof of the building. Imagine the sound of nails screaming as they are ripped from wood. Imagine the sound of massive timber beams, beams that were hoisted by cranes and men, snapping like dry twigs. The roof lifts. It hovers for a split second, weightless, suspended in the updraft. And then it is thrown. It crashes into the street below. And now the monster is in the city. We need to pause here. We need to understand what is happening on Garrison Avenue. This is the main artery of Fort Smith. It is lined with businesses, brick buildings, glass storefronts, saloons, pharmacies. In 1898, glass was a sign of prosperity. Large plate glass windows were expensive. They were a status symbol. When the tornado hits Garrison Avenue, it turns that status symbol into shrapnel. Every window on the street shatters simultaneously. If you were standing there, if you could survive the wind, you would have seen a blizzard, but not of snow. A blizzard of glass, millions of shards, swirling in the vortex, scouring the brick, stripping the paint from the walls, shredding the awnings. The street itself, the dirt and the cobblestones, is instantly coated in a layer of glittering, deadly debris. And in the darkness, in the pitch black, nobody can see it. They can only hear it, the sound of a city being eaten alive. The tornado is moving east-northeast. It is cutting a scar through the town. It is selective. It is capricious. It skips one building, leaving a flower pot on a windowsill undisturbed, and then it obliterates the building next door, leaving nothing but a slab of foundation. This is the terror of the tornado. It has no logic that we can understand. It is a chaotic system, a spinning top of violence. And as it moves, it changes. It is no longer just air. It has sucked up the cemetery wall. It has sucked up the trees. It has sucked up the roof of the Opera House. It has sucked up the carts and the wagons and the signs from the street. It is a debris ball, a solid, grinding, rotating wall of matter. It acts like a giant piece of sandpaper. Anything it touches is not just blown down, it is sanded away, and it is heading directly for the residential district. Let's move down the street. Let's move away from the commercial district to where the people are sleeping. Mrs. Burgess's boarding house. This is a large, sturdy home, a place of shelter, a place where travelers and workers and families stay while they are passing through Fort Smith. Tonight, on January 11th, the house is full. 25 people are inside, 25 hearts beating in the dark. Some are in the upstairs bedrooms. Some are in the parlor, perhaps sleeping on cots. They heard the hail too. They heard the wind pick up. Maybe someone sat up in bed. Maybe Mrs. Burgess herself walked to the hallway, tightening her robe, wondering if she should check the windows. She hears the roar, but it's too late to run. It's too late to go to the cellar. The tornado doesn't knock. It slams into the boarding house with the force of a bomb. We have to visualize the physics of this collapse to understand the horror of what the rescuers would find later. A house is a box. It relies on its corners to stand up. The wind hits the structure. It lifts the roof, destroying the structural integrity of the box. Without the roof to hold the walls together, the walls bow outward, and then gravity takes over. The floors, the heavy wooden floors where people are sleeping. They have nothing to hold them up. They fall. They pancake. The second floor crashes onto the first floor. The first floor crashes into the basement. 25 people, beds, dressers, wardrobes, beams, bricks, all of it, plunging into the dark, wet hole of the cellar. The noise of the collapse is deafening, a thunderclap of timber and stone. But the most terrifying sound is the silence that follows. For a moment, after the wind passes, there is nothing. No screams, no crying, just the settling of dust. Because the survivors, the ones who weren't killed instantly by the crushing weight, are trapped. They are buried under tons of debris. They are pinned in the dark. They can't breathe. They can't move. Imagine waking up, if you were asleep. One moment, you are in a warm bed. The next moment, you are in pitch blackness. You are upside down. There is a wooden beam pressing against your chest. There is grit in your mouth. You smell natural gas. You smell pulverized plaster. You try to call out, but you don't have enough air in your lungs. You hear, close to you, the sound of someone else breathing. Sharp, panicked breaths. Is anyone there? A whisper in the dark. I can't move my legs. Help me. Oh God, help me. Mrs. Burgess's boarding house, a place of rest, has become a tomb. And the monster is still moving. It hasn't slowed down. It is just digested. It is hungry for more. As we follow the path of the storm, we have to stop and look at the strange, almost impossible things it did. Tornadoes are famous for their freak accidents. The piece of straw driven through a telephone pole. The chickens plucked clean of their feathers but left alive. In Fort Smith, the freak accidents were heavy. A church bell. The Baptist church stood in the path of the storm. It had a bell, a massive cast iron bell. It weighed hundreds of pounds. It was designed to ring out over the city, to call the faithful to prayer. The wind didn't just knock the tower down. It grabbed the bell. It carried it, like a child throwing a pebble. The tornado hurled that cast iron bell 100 feet through the air. Think about the energy required to do that. Think about the sheer, brute force needed to make heavy metal fly. It defies gravity. It defies logic. But nature doesn't care about our logic. Clothing, simple things, shirts, trousers, dresses. The storm raided closets. It ripped clothes off of bodies. And it threw them, not across the street, not across the river, but across the county. Debris from Fort Smith, signage from businesses, letters from desks, photographs from mantles, began to rain down on the countryside. 22 miles away, 30 miles away, a farmer, waking up the next morning in a town called Alma, might walk out into his field and find a woman's dress hanging from a tree branch, a dress that belongs to a ghost. This is the teleportation of the tornado. It scatters the intimate details of people's lives across the map. It turns private memories into public debris. But the cruelest trick, the darkest irony of the night, happened at the new Fort Smith High School. This building was the pride of the city. It was brand new. It was massive. It was built of red brick. It sat on a hill, overlooking the town. It was a monument to the future, to education, to the children. It was so new that the school board hadn't even finalized the insurance policy yet. It was totally exposed. Dr. W.T. Cate lived next door. Dr. Cate was a man of science, a man of reason. He lived in a modest, comfortable home in the shadow of the great school. He probably felt safe there. The school was a fortress. It blocked the wind. It was a shield. But in a tornado, a shield can become a weapon. The tornado strikes the high school at approximately 11:16 p.m. It hits the structure squarely. The pressure inside the school creates a vacuum. The windows blow out. And then, the roof, the entire roof structure of the high school, tons of slate, timber, and trusses, is ripped free. It doesn't just fall down. It flies. It becomes a massive, rectangular projectile. It sails through the darkness, passing over the fence, passing over the yard, and it crashes directly onto the home of Dr. W.T. Cate. Dr. Cate is inside. He hears the roar. He feels the house shake. And then, the sky falls on him. His house is not just destroyed. It is crushed. It is flattened by the very building that was supposed to represent the city's progress. Dr. Cate is driven into the floor. Rubble piles up on top of him. Brick, mortar, and the massive beams of the school roof. He is pinned. He is alive, but he is buried. He is trapped in a space no bigger than a coffin. The dust chokes him. The darkness is absolute. He can't hear the wind anymore. He can only hear the settling of the ruins, the creak of wood under tension, and then he smells it. The smell that every survivor of the 1898 tornado remembers. The smell that turns the disaster from a tragedy into a horror story. Gas. Beneath the city, the iron pipes that carry natural gas to the streetlights and the stoves have been ruptured. The earth has shifted. The roots of the trees have pulled the pipes apart. The falling buildings have smashed the lines. Gas is hissing into the pockets of the rubble. It is filling the basements. It is filling the void where Dr. Cate is lying. It is filling the wreckage of the boarding house where 25 people are screaming. The wind has stopped. The monster has lifted back into the clouds, disappearing as quickly as it came. The noise of the freight train is gone, but now a new sound begins, the sound of a spark, the sound of a flame catching hold. The wind killed the buildings, but the fire is coming for the survivors. The wind has stopped. For the first time in 10 minutes, the roar is gone. The freight trains have passed. The grinding of the mountain is over. In the immediate aftermath of a tornado, there is usually a moment of profound confusion. Survivors crawl out of cellars. They stand up in fields that used to be living rooms. They look for the stars. But in Fort Smith, on the night of January 11th, there were no stars. There was only pitch blackness, a heavy, suffocating darkness, and then a smell, sharp, rotten, pungent. The smell of the earth bleeding, gas lines, severed by the upheaval of tree roots and foundations, were hissing into the night air. And then a sound. Not the wind, not the rain. Crackle, snap, whoosh. In the ruins of the lodging house district, a spark found a pocket of gas. Maybe it was a coal stove that had been overturned. Maybe it was a kerosene lamp that shattered against a wall. It doesn't matter what started it. What matters is what happened next. A flame shoots up from the wreckage. It is small at first, a flicker of orange in a sea of black. But then it jumps. It finds dry timber. It finds splinters of furniture. It finds the gas leaking from the ground. The fire begins to roar. This is the nightmare scenario. This is the thing that keeps disaster planners awake at night. The storm has trapped the victims. It has pinned them under tons of brick and wood, and now the fire is coming to finish the job. Imagine being trapped. You are pinned by a beam. You are unhurt, perhaps just bruised. You can hear your neighbors calling out. You think the worst is over, and then you feel the heat. You see the orange glow reflecting off the smoke, and you realize you can't move. The panic that set in over Fort Smith in those next few minutes was primal. It wasn't the fear of nature anymore. It was the fear of a medieval death. Survivors who had freed themselves began to run toward the piles of rubble. They didn't have tools. They didn't have gloves. They tore at the jagged wood with their bare hands. They could hear the screams of the trapped, and they could see the fire crawling closer and closer. We have to zoom in now. We have to look at one specific tragedy to understand the scale of this horror. We have to look at Will Lawson. Will was inside a building on Garrison Avenue when the storm hit. He was with his wife. When the walls collapsed, they were thrown together into the debris. Will survived the impact. He was battered, bruised, covered in dust. But he was alive. He found himself pinned in a small pocket of space. He reached out in the dark. "Are you there? I'm here." His wife was right beside him, close enough to touch, close enough to hold. But she was pinned. A massive timber, part of the roof structure, had fallen across her lower body. It was immovable. It was the weight of the entire building pressing down on her. Will pushed. He shoved against the wood until his muscles screamed. He clawed at the debris until his fingers bled. It wouldn't budge. And then he smelled the smoke. He looked through a gap in the wreckage. He saw the orange glow. The building was on fire. The flames were eating their way through the dry wood, moving toward them. Will Lawson fought like a man possessed. He pulled. He screamed for help. But the roar of the fire was getting louder. The heat was becoming unbearable. The air was turning into smoke. His wife looked at him. She knew. She knew that the fire was going to reach them. And she knew that Will could get out. He was only partially trapped. He could wriggle free. But she was anchored to the floor. We don't know the exact words they said to each other in those final moments. History doesn't record the whispers between a husband and wife as death approaches. But we know the choice Will had to make: stay and burn with her, or leave and live. The flames were licking the wood above their heads. The heat was blistering their skin. She told him to go. Save yourself. Will Lawson, weeping, burned, broken, had to let go of his wife's hand. He had to crawl out of that hole. He had to turn his back on the woman he loved and listen to the fire take her. He emerged onto the street, a survivor. But a survivor of what? He carried that moment, that impossible choice, for the rest of his life. This is the cruelty of the Fort Smith tornado. It didn't just kill people, it forced them to make bargains with death. While Will Lawson was stumbling away from the fire, a different kind of drama was playing out at the city power plant. The city was in chaos. Fires were popping up everywhere. The electrical lines were down. Live wires were dancing in the streets, sparking, igniting the gas, electrocuting horses and potentially rescuers. The city engineers faced a dilemma. If they left the power on, the rescuers would have light. They could see the victims, they could see where to dig. But if they left the power on, the live wires would start more fires. They would kill more people. They had to choose sight or safety. At approximately 11:30 p.m., the order was given: kill it. The massive switches were thrown, the turbines spun down, and the city of Fort Smith, or what was left of it, plunged into total, absolute darkness. The streetlights died, the porch lights died. The only light left came from the fires burning in the ruins. The rescuers were now working blind. Imagine trying to lift a heavy beam off a child in pitch blackness. Imagine trying to navigate a field of broken glass and razor-sharp metal without being able to see your own feet. Men shouted for lanterns. Bring the lanterns! But the wind had blown them all away, so they worked by the flashes of lightning. Every time the storm, which was still rumbling to the east, flashed a bolt of lightning, the scene would illuminate for a fraction of a second. Flash, a pile of bricks. Darkness, flash, a hand reaching out from the rubble. Darkness. Flash. A face. Darkness. It was a strobe-light nightmare, a series of horrific photographs, burned into the retinas of the rescuers. But in that darkness, there were heroes. Let's go back to the high school, to the pile of rubble that was crushing Dr. Kate's house. The police couldn't get there, the fire department couldn't get there, the streets were impassable. So, it was up to the neighbors. It was up to Bob Hirschberg. Bob was a local man, a tough man. He grabbed his son, he grabbed a shovel, and he ran toward the sound of the destruction. He arrived at the site of the high school collapse. It was a mountain of debris. Somewhere underneath it, people were alive. Bob didn't wait for orders. He didn't wait for the sun. He started digging. This wasn't delicate archaeology. This was brute force excavation. Bob and his son worked in the dark. They used their shovels until they hit wood. Then they used their hands. They tore at the lath and plaster. They found a gap, a void in the rubble. They crawled inside, into the unstable, creaking, terrifying belly of the collapse. They found one person, pulled them out. They went back in. They found another. They worked for hours. Their lungs filled with dust. Their hands were raw meat. They found Dr. Kate. The doctor was pinned, barely conscious, terrified. Bob Hirschberg pulled the debris off him. He dragged him through the tunnel of wreckage, out into the cool night air. Dr. Kate took a breath. He looked at the man who saved him. He looked at the ruins of his life. But Bob didn't stop to celebrate. He went back in. By the time the sun came up, Bob Hirschberg and his son had pulled 17 people out of that pile alive. 17 souls, 17 families that would not be planning a funeral that week. In the midst of the day of dread, in the midst of the failures of construction and the cruelty of the wind, Bob Hirschberg proved that the human spirit is stronger than brick and mortar. The sun rose on January 12th at 7:16 a.m. It was a gray, dreary dawn. The sky was still heavy with clouds, but the light revealed the truth. Survivors who had huddled in their basements all night finally emerged. They climbed up the stairs. They pushed open the cellar doors, and they stopped. They blinked, because the world they knew was gone. The visual impact of a tornado aftermath is hard to comprehend if you haven't seen it. It isn't just that the buildings are down, it's that the landscape has been rewritten. Landmarks are erased. Trees that had stood for 50 years were gone, leaving only jagged stumps. The Grand Opera House, a skeleton. The high school, a crater. Garrison Avenue looked like a war zone. It looked like it had been shelled by artillery for a week. But as the morning went on, and the telegraph lines began to hum with news, the true scale of the power became clear. Reports started coming in from the countryside, from Alma, from Mulberry, from towns 30 miles away. We found a sign from a grocery store in Fort Smith. We found a checkbook belonging to a man on Garrison Avenue. We found a child's nightgown, hanging on a fence post, unharmed. The storm had taken the intimate fabric of the city and scattered it across the state. People walked through the debris field in a daze. They picked up objects. A broken clock stopped at 11:15. A photograph of a wedding party. The faces scratched out by the sand. They were walking through a graveyard of memories. The final count was 55 dead, 113 injured, millions of dollars in damage, in 1898 currency. It was, at the time, the deadliest tornado in Arkansas history. They called it the Day of Dread. Funerals were held for weeks. The city wore black. The sound of hammers and saws rebuilding the town became the soundtrack of the spring. Fort Smith rebuilt. Of course it did. The Opera House was repaired. The high school was rebuilt. This time with insurance. Life returned to normal. The normalcy bias eventually grew back, just like the grass. But for the generation that lived through it, the scar remained. Every time the wind shifted in January, every time the sky turned that bruised purple color, every time the humidity spiked on a winter night, they would stop. They would look up. George Carter's family, Dr. Kate, Will Lawson, Bob Hirschberg. They would remember the sound of the freight train. They would remember the smell of the gas. They would remember the darkness at noon and the death at midnight. If you go to the National Cemetery in Fort Smith today, you can see the wall. It has been rebuilt. It is strong. It is sturdy. But if you look closely at the trees, at the old oaks that line the path, you can still see the gaps. You can see where the canopy is thin. Nature heals, but it remembers. The wind is invisible. We cannot see it. We cannot hold it. But on January 11th, 1898, the wind proved that it can hold us, and it can let us drop whenever it chooses. This has been a forensic timeline of the Fort Smith tornado. Until next time, keep an eye on the sky, and don't trust the warm wind in January.